Thank you, Bernard, and everyone for being here. I really am just delighted to be here with all of you and to explore uncertainment together. Yaron and Bernard, you've both been in the lounge, but for everyone else, I'll try to provide some context. Thank you for introducing yourselves. I feel a theme building. And I think the way I would personally connect to your introductions is that I also feel uncertainty moving from the periphery to the center of my experience over the last couple of years. And so today I'll be giving a brief telling of that story. And then we'll go right into the practice together, and then wrap up the session with some exchange and reflection and feedback and just whatever's alive. So after we do the practice, I'll ask you for feedback about what our next step should be. But yes, I am also experiencing, as Eva said, the real enlivenment of our times. For those of us, I think, that steward and cultivate learning groups, this is an incredible moment that we're experiencing and participating with. So to that end, I'll go right into it. Maybe I'll just make a couple of quick comments in response to Bernard's prompt about the developmental connections. As Bernard said, we met through the DDO group founded by Brian Ungard, and the late Brian Ungard, who unfortunately we just lost very recently. Many of you probably know, worked very closely with Robert Keegan and Lisa Leahy and Kaz Gotts in the context of the Decurion company. And for, I think, about a decade, actually, they had a long engagement together. So the DDO group, that learning organizational service network, was an outgrowth of that work. So yes, I have a long-standing interest in integral theory and developmental models and cross-model comparisons in the whole world of cognitive development. I've been, as you all know well, Otto Lasky has a very unique approach to cognition and knowing and measuring hidden dimensions. So I will try in my talk to make some connections, to knit some of that together, and also to provide maybe moments for us to be in dialogue about together. I think that one of the dilemmas that I'm practicing with myself, one of the ways that this is a zone of proximal development for me, is in the role of facilitator. And I've talked to Bernard a little bit about that. On the one hand, I want to protect the practice because it's so young and diffuse and nebulous. I want to resist the temptation to codify it. And on the other hand, it's important to make some distinctions. So that's the space that I'm playing with. And I'll say more about that as I get into the very brief framing that I'll share with you now. So beginning by taking our cues from the poet and psychologist Bayo Akomolafe, this is such an unusual and punctuated moment, as we're all so well aware. So the Uncertainment Lounge is asking the question, if liminal times call for emergent and counter-normative practices, what new language and praxis might we cultivate in order to bring forth the uncertainty curious dispositions that our challenging times seem to evoke? The poet John Keats called it negative capability, the capacity to kindle states of generative uncertainty in knowing, being, and doing. The Uncertainment Lounge takes the form of a twice weekly virtual we space. And our experiment began in the university context at the Parsons School of Design in New York. It was a way to cope and to learn together in the novelty of the emerging pandemic. Personally, I don't know how to do uncertainment, so this remains a zone of proximal development for me. Now, in order to foster the conditions for transformative dialogue and practice, participants at the lounge choose to be with the unknowable and the uncontrollable in real time. So it's a self-selected group of individuals that find uncertainty not off-putting, but curiosity evoking. Uncertainty then serves as a contextual frame to invite playful engagement with creative tension and ambiguity. We were basically there to cultivate collective attention around the subtle, nebulous, emergent, and novel dimensions of experience. So it's not limited to the subtle, but we are extra attuned to the subtle dimensions. Now, in keeping with what I've just said, by design, we don't use any maps or agendas. In fact, that is the primary rule or agenda, is that we don't have a destination. And we're finding that that is crucial to maintaining the vitality of the process itself. So people are showing up randomly. Some people regularly, some people sporadically, and we're there to acknowledge, witness, and stay curious about our own uncertainties. So therefore, with love, we lovingly forego the contextual frames that tend to prime our expectations and tend to help us orient toward the familiar and toward the sense of control that knowing promises, and that makes knowing so addictive and enticing. A key social agreement of the Uncertainment Lounge is granting mutual permission not to know. And I would say this relates strongly to Robert Keegan's DDO frame, in the sense that the minimum viable condition of a DDO is to opt into a container where we honor one another exactly where we are, and honor that this is a learning experience for everyone, and grant that mutual permission not to know. And I would add, another condition is the willingness to recreate the rules and process in real time. We opt into a random assortment of very heterogeneous meaning making, and we lean into the risk that's implied in configuring the rules and the boundaries as we go along. We're also playing with tracking our real-time state experiences while we build a relational social field. Another condition would be orientation toward inquiry rather than declaratives. So some questions might include, how might I participate more fully with the unknowable and uncontrollable in myself? And under what circumstances am I contracting into a consensus view or a familiar role or a tribal explanation? And finally, in what ways might being uncertain together help us to enact meaningful, relevant, and useful responses to our unique life conditions? The Uncertainment Lounge has attracted a small intact practice cohort. So the experience is, as I said a moment ago, very contingent upon who shows up and what they bring in the moment to this ensemble practice. I'm learning that this randomness really makes the space in the sense that we're not tracking an intact cohort boundary, we're tracking the changing rules and patterns. So there are regulars, as I said, but there's more discontinuity than you might imagine. We mimic, we bend, we break patterns of interaction. We notice and sometimes get underneath our biases and our habits. We negotiate our points of sameness and difference in the gross and subtle dimensions. And although this is not a sense-making practice per se, I would call it an oblique sense-making practice in the sense that certainties and distinctions happen, and incoherence may also happen, as well as tensions and silences. Dialogos and a certain nonlinear group flow may or may not take place. Now, what are we learning? Well, so many things. For one, we're learning that showing up uncertain together is simple but not easy. It's week to week, it takes a certain willingness of disposition to put myself and to ask my colleagues and friends to join me in that vulnerable space of revealing and inquiring in real time. Because we tend to be educated, socialized, and incentivized to be certain, it's probably no big surprise that uncertainment is actually a very challenging practice. I'm also noticing that I arise as we are. So my self-concept, the way I'm defining myself as a process is constantly evolving, and the space is helping me to feel and sense and know things about that. As I said a moment ago, I am constantly attempting to resist codifying the practice too much at this time in order to give it enough space to become what is useful. Some challenges for me personally are the ways that the conditioned parts of myself reflexively orient to pre-existing constructs of what is facilitation, what is pedagogy, what is dialectic, what can I know, how can I be safe and maintain continuity of self, and how can I let go of that continuity of self enough to be of service to myself and others. So my habits of certainty seeking and my role boundness to certain identities can sometimes be more, can overpower my ability to practice with agility. What ultimately or provisionally, what's at stake in kindling this collective capacity, and why does it matter, especially given that there's such a proliferation of dialogue processes and practices? I think creating a tight framing of a practice space through the lens of uncertainty may be particularly useful for building capacity to build capacity. And I think that is the whole conversation around the UNDP goals and the inner developmental goals. This is so key to think about negative capability as one of several meta capacities without which we won't be able to transcend our current human limitations. So by confronting the paradox that the ways of knowing that got us here no longer have optimal survival advantage, I think that's one of the ways that we have a breakthrough or seek a breakthrough. Also by overcoming our reluctance to think together with people we are different from in service of meaningful societal change. And also by extending, as I just said, extending our capability to be aware and to respond in life positive ways to can our very ways of dialogue and communication and sharing be oriented toward life and life-giving. And I would add that Uncertainment seems to catalyze the latent potential of the group because it's an open invitation to be something that you do not know yourself to be. So now with that brief framing, I'd like to warmly welcome you all into the practice these are typically our shared agreements. And I realize that some people can't have their camera on today due to various things, so don't worry. But I just wanted to share with you the basic shared agreements of the space. Be present, ideally with camera on, speak when you are moved to speak, and please maintain confidentiality of participant identity. And it's not necessary to be confidential about the practice itself. And then the most difficult injunction is to refrain from certainty. That's the key practice, which is easier said than done. So for the next 45 to 60 minutes, we'll collectively practice. And then when the time seems right, we'll shift into some form of reflection, and we'll source that here from the group together. And as we begin, we will take a moment here to get present and just to get back in touch with our feelings, thoughts, and sensations. So have a sit back, rest back into the body, take a moment. Take a nice deep breath into the belly. Move, stretch, vocalize. Find your feet. Find the stillness of your ground. Find that part of you that knows. Find that part of you that is secure and grounded in knowing, always already knowing. And likewise, honor and appreciate the parts of you that have no idea what we're doing right now. And the parts of you that want to turn off your camera and run for the hills. And just smile broadly into all of your aspects, all of your diversity and complexity. Take a moment just to scan thoughts that might be tugging for attention, feelings perhaps bubbling up, or body sensations. Take a moment to think about whether there's anything uncertain or especially uncertain that you might want to explore or share or put into the space for consideration. Take another deep breath and then we'll begin.